There is something society has slowly forgotten. The elderly are not weak. They have simply lived long enough to be silent. Those teens believed age was a burden and patience was a sign of fear. They didn't know the woman in front of them had spent her life raising those who protect this country. They didn't know her son once wore the uniform and never came home. And they certainly didn't know his teammate, a Navy SEAL, was standing there beside a dog who never misses danger. Because respecting the elderly is not politeness. It is the measure of who we are as a society. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, like, subscribe, and stay with us. The snow came down sideways, not gently, not the kind that softened streets or made people nostalgic. This snow cut through the air like it had somewhere urgent to be, driven by wind sharp enough to sting exposed skin. It clung to coats, filled the cuffs of boots, and turned every breath into a thin white cloud that vanished as quickly as it formed. Wyatt Hale pulled his collar higher as he pushed open the door of the small grocery store. A bell rang overhead, tinny, tired, the sound of something that had announced arrivals for decades without expecting much to change. Warm air rushed out to meet him, carrying the mixed scents of brewed coffee, cleaning solution, and overripe fruit. Beside him, the German shepherd paused at the threshold. Briggs was a large dog, nearly 7 years old, black and tan with a broad chest and steady limbs built for endurance rather than speed. A faint scar curved along the edge of his right ear, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. His amber eyes scanned the room before he stepped inside, head level, posture calm but alert. Wyatt waited for him. He always did. Wyatt stood just over 6 feet tall, his build lean and compact strength folded inward, not displayed. He wore a worn, olive-gray tactical combat shirt beneath a weathered jacket, the fabric softened by years of use. His combat pants were old too, earth-toned, knees scuffed, pockets sagging slightly from habit. His boots bore the scratches of long miles. On his wrist, an old military watch ticked steadily, indifferent to weather and place. He was clean-shaven. No beard to hide the sharp lines of his jaw or the disciplined angles of his face. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, grown just enough past regulation to soften it slightly. His skin was light but weathered, marked by wind and cold. His eyes, gray-blue, observant, held the look of a man who had learned to see without staring, to judge without announcing it. He did not come to Gray Pine to make a point. He came because the road led here, and the storm decided the rest. Inside the store, a handful of people moved quietly through the aisles. No music played. Only the low hum of refrigeration units and the occasional scrape of a cartwheel against the floor. Near the back, an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair beside the dairy case. She wore a faded sea blue puffer coat, the color softened by time, the fabric slightly collapsed at the seams. The coat looked old but well cared for, zipped halfway up, a gray knit scarf tucked neatly at her neck. Her hair was white and fine, pulled back carefully, revealing a face lined by years rather than neglect. Her hands rested on her lap, gloved, fingers curled inward as if conserving warmth. She studied a shelf of milk cartons, eyes narrowed in concentration. A plastic bottle of water sat in the cup holder of her chair. Wyatt noticed her because Briggs noticed her. The dog slowed as they passed, his gaze lingering, not alarmed, not curious, but attentive. Wyatt followed the line of that attention, then moved on. 2 aisles over, laughter broke the quiet. Too loud, too sharp. Wyatt turned his head slightly. 4 teenage boys stood near the snacks and drinks, blocking part of the aisle. They were clean cut in a careless way. Expensive jackets worn loosely, sneakers too clean for winter, confidence sitting on their shoulders like something they had never been asked to justify. One of them, the tallest, held a bottle of soda in his hand, swinging it idly as he laughed. Another leaned against a freezer door, smirking. Their voices bounced off the shelves, demanding space. They didn't notice the woman in the wheelchair until one of them stepped backward. The impact wasn't violent, just careless. The chair jolted, the bottle of water tipped, liquid splashed down, darkening the leg of the boy's pants and spattering his shoes. The store went quiet. The boy looked down slowly. Then he laughed. "Seriously?" he said, lifting his foot. "What the hell?" The elderly woman startled, hands gripping the armrests. Oh, I'm so sorry," she said quickly, her voice thin but clear. "I didn't see. Please, I didn't mean—" The boy stepped closer. "You just ruined my shoes," he said, his tone shifting, hardening. "Do you know how much these cost?" She shook her head. I'm sorry. I can wipe them, if you like. I didn't—" One of the others snorted. "Maybe you shouldn't be out here if you can't control where you're going." Another added louder, "Yeah, people like you just get in the way." The woman's shoulders drew inward. "I only came to get a few things," she said softly. "My husband—" The tall boy cut her off. "That's not our problem." Wyatt had stopped moving. Briggs stood at his side, body angled slightly forward now, ears alert but still. No sound came from him. Wyatt watched, not because he was unsure what to do, but because he had learned, long ago, that the moment before action mattered. That you saw more if you waited just long enough. The boy gestured at his wet pants. "You gonna pay for this or what?" The woman's eyes flicked around the store. No one spoke. No one met her gaze. She swallowed. "I don't have much," she said, "but if you give me a moment, I can—" The tallest boy laughed again. "Unbelievable." Wyatt stepped forward. Not fast, not loud, just enough. "That's enough," he said. The sound of his voice was calm, low, carrying without effort. It wasn't the voice of someone asking permission. Every head turned. The tall boy looked at Wyatt, eyes flicking briefly to Briggs, then back. "Who asked you?" Wyatt met his gaze evenly. "No one needs to ask." He shifted slightly, placing himself between the boy and the woman's wheelchair, not touching either, just occupying the space. "You bumped into her," Wyatt continued. "You spilled your own drink. Walk away." The boy's jaw tightened. "You threatening me?" Wyatt's expression didn't change. "No." Briggs stepped forward half a pace. Still silent, still controlled. The dog's presence changed the air. The boy hesitated. His friends exchanged glances, bravado thinning. The elderly woman looked up at Wyatt, eyes wide. "Please," she said. "It's all right. I don't want trouble." Wyatt glanced down at her. "You're not the one causing it." He looked back at the boys. "Leave." For a moment, It seemed like the tall boy might push it. Then he scoffed, stepping back. "Whatever," he muttered. "Not worth it." As they turned away, the tall boy's eyes flicked back once cold, measuring. Wyatt didn't miss it. He waited until they were gone before turning to the woman. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her hands still trembled slightly. "Yes, thank you." She studied his face, then Briggs. "You remind me of my son," she said suddenly. Wyatt paused. "He would have been about your age," she added quietly, "if he were still here." The words settled between them, heavier than the storm outside. Wyatt didn't ask questions. He simply nodded. "Would you like to sit for a moment? Somewhere warm?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "That would be nice." As he guided her chair toward the small seating area near the front, Briggs walked close, matching pace. Behind them, the bell over the door rang again. Outside, the snow kept falling. And somewhere, in the white blur, beyond the glass, something had already decided this wasn't over. The storm did not ease when they left the grocery store. If anything, it grew heavier, the snow thickening into dense sheets that erased distance and softened sound. The parking lot lights glowed like blurred halos, each one wrapped in white. Tires crunched slowly as cars crept away, drivers hunched over their wheels as if bracing against more than weather. Wyatt guided the wheelchair carefully, one hand steady on the handle, the other ready to correct if the wheels slid. Briggs walked close to the woman's right side, his shoulder almost level with her knee, adjusting his pace to match hers without instruction. She noticed. "You don't have to walk so close," she said gently. "He prefers it," Wyatt replied. Briggs flicked one ear, as if acknowledging the truth of that statement. They stopped beneath the store's small awning, sheltered from the worst of the wind. Wyatt glanced down at the woman. "My name's Wyatt," he said. "What's yours?" She hesitated, as though weighing whether her name still mattered to strangers. Then she smiled faintly. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Wren." Her voice carried a calmness that hadn't been there inside the store. Out here, away from eyes and judgment, she seemed to breathe more easily. Wyatt nodded. "Do you live far from here?" "Not far," Eleanor said. "Just past the old cedar line. My husband didn't want me coming out in weather like this." "But—" She trailed off, glancing at the dark sky. The fridge was empty. Wyatt didn't comment. He'd learned long ago that necessity often ignored pride. He steered the chair toward the sidewalk, careful where the snow had packed down into slick layers. Eleanor watched his hands, noticing the absence of hesitation, the way he anticipated each uneven patch before it became a problem. "You've done this before," she said. "Yes," Wyatt answered simply. Briggs paused suddenly, nose lifting into the wind. His body went still, not rigid, not tense, but listening. Wyatt felt the change immediately and slowed. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. Briggs turned his head slightly, then resumed walking as if nothing had happened. "Probably nothing," Wyatt said, though he filed the moment away. They reached a small cafe on the corner, its windows fogged, light warm inside. A hand-painted sign in the window read, "Open. Hot drinks." Wyatt didn't ask. He turned toward the door. Inside, the warmth was immediate, wrapping around them like a blanket. The place was nearly empty. Just a man at the counter, nursing coffee, and a woman near the back, reading from a folded paperback. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 40s, tall and slender, with dark auburn hair pulled into a low bun. Her skin was pale from long winters, her face marked by fine lines at the eyes that spoke of patience rather than age. She wore a thick sweater beneath her apron, sleeves pushed up, forearms strong from work. She looked up as the door chimed. "Come on in," she said, voice low and steady. "Weather's not playing nice tonight." Wyatt nodded. "Two hot waters if you have them." The woman's gaze moved briefly to Eleanor, then to Briggs. Something softened there. "I'm Sarah," she said. "Sit wherever's comfortable." Wyatt positioned the wheelchair near a small table by the wall, making sure Eleanor had space. Briggs lay down beside them, curling his body just enough to keep contact without crowding. Sarah returned with steaming mugs, setting them down carefully. "On the house," she said. "No arguing." Eleanor smiled. "Thank you." Sarah hesitated a moment longer. "You folks okay? I saw some boys outside earlier. Loud ones." Wyatt met her eyes. "We're fine." Sarah nodded once. "If you need anything, you let me know." As she walked away, Eleanor wrapped her hands around the mug, sighing softly as warmth seeped into her fingers. "I don't usually stop like this," she said. "But tonight, I think I needed to sit." Wyatt leaned back slightly, giving her space. "You said you had a son." Eleanor's gaze dropped to the steam rising from her cup. "Yes." She didn't say anything else for several seconds. Wyatt didn't rush her. "Daniel," she said finally. "Daniel Wren." Briggs lifted his head at the sound of the name. Eleanor noticed. "He reacts when I say it," she murmured. Wyatt watched the dog. "He listens to tone more than words." She nodded slowly. "Daniel had that too. He always knew when something was wrong before anyone said it." Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug. "He was strong, not loud about it. He joined the Navy right after high school. Said he wanted to do something that mattered." Wyatt's jaw set, just a fraction. "He didn't talk much about his work," Eleanor continued. "Letters were careful. Calls were short. But when he came home on leave," she smiled at the memory, "he'd sit at the table and listen to his father talk like time hadn't passed at all." She glanced up at Wyatt. "My husband was Navy too, long before Daniel. Different wars, same bones afterward." Wyatt nodded. "It stays with you." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly, "it does." Her voice steadied as she went on. "Daniel died 2 years ago. They said it was quick. An operation overseas, no details, just a folded flag and words that sounded rehearsed." Briggs stood, not abruptly, just enough to reposition himself closer to Eleanor's chair, his flank pressing lightly against the wheel. Eleanor reached out without looking and rested her hand on his head. "I still talk to him," she admitted, "when the house gets too quiet, when his father's leg keeps him awake. When I'm scared, I'll forget the sound of his voice." Wyatt felt something tighten behind his ribs. "You don't forget," he said. "Not really." She met his eyes. "Do you have children?" "No," Wyatt replied. "Family?" Wyatt hesitated. "Just him," he said, nodding to Briggs. That seemed to satisfy her. They sat in silence for a while, the cafe's low sounds filling the Gap's cups clinking, the soft hiss of the espresso machine, wind pressing against the windows. Halfway through their drinks, Briggs did something unusual. He lifted his head, ears angling toward the door, not sharply, not alerting. His gaze fixed on the glass, tail still. Wyatt noticed instantly. "What is it, boy?" Briggs didn't look back. Instead, he rose and walked to the door, stopping just short of it. He sat there, perfectly still, eyes locked on the snow beyond the glass. Wyatt followed his line of sight. Outside, through the falling snow, a figure stood beneath the streetlight across the road. Then another, too far to make out faces, close enough to know they weren't waiting for the bus. Eleanor's breath caught. "Is something wrong?" Wyatt kept his voice calm. "Probably just people out in the storm." But he didn't believe it. After a long moment, the figures moved on, swallowed by white and shadow. Briggs remained seated for several seconds longer, then returned to his place beside Eleanor as if nothing had happened. Wyatt's pulse slowed only slightly. Sarah approached quietly. "Everything okay?" "Yes," Wyatt said. "Thank you." When they finished their drinks, Wyatt stood. "Let me take you home." Eleanor nodded. "I'd like that." The walk back was quieter. The storm dulled sound until the world felt distant, insulated. Eleanor pointed out landmarks, an old hardware store, a closed school, the stand of cedars near her street. The house came into view at last. It was small and tired, paint peeling in places, the porch light dim but steady. Snow had piled against the steps. A single window glowed faintly from within. Eleanor looked at it with something like relief. "My husband worries," she said softly. "He doesn't like not knowing where I am." Wyatt positioned the chair at the bottom of the steps and reached for the ramp folded against the side. The door opened before they reached it. A man stood there, leaning heavily on a cane. He was tall despite his stoop, shoulders broad beneath an old wool coat. His hair was gray and cropped short, his beard neatly trimmed. His face was deeply lined, not with softness, but with endurance. "Ellie," he said, voice rough with worry, "what took you so long?" "I stopped for a warm drink," she replied gently. "I wasn't alone." She gestured to Wyatt. The man studied him carefully. Then his gaze shifted to Briggs. Something unreadable crossed his face. "Thank you," he said finally. "For bringing her home," Wyatt nodded. "Of course." As he turned to leave, Briggs paused at the edge of the yard and looked back toward the trees beyond the house. Wyatt followed his gaze. Snow fell heavier again, and somewhere in the dark, the night listened. The road narrowed after the cafe, the snowbanks rising higher on either side as if the town were slowly closing its hands. Streetlights thinned, then disappeared altogether, replaced by the pale wash of moonlight reflecting off untouched snow. Tires hummed softly. The world felt hushed listening. Wyatt drove carefully, both hands steady on the wheel. Eleanor's directions were sparse but precise, offered with the calm confidence of someone who had traveled this route in every season for decades. "Left at the cedar stand," she said, "then straight until the pavement gives up." It did. Asphalt faded into packed gravel, then into something closer to memory than road. The car eased forward, suspension creaking gently as it climbed the last short rise. Briggs sat upright in the back, head level with the window, breath fogging the glass. His posture was calm, but his attention was not loose. He tracked the dark beyond the headlights, ears pivoting subtly, cataloging what didn't belong. The house appeared without ceremony. It was small, single-story, paint long past its prime. White once, perhaps. Now, a tired, off gray, chipped at the corners where wind and winter had taken their turns. The porch sagged slightly at one end, railings worn smooth by hands that had leaned there year after year. Snow drifted up against the foundation, softening its edges. A single light glowed from the front window. Eleanor exhaled. "That's us." Wyatt pulled in and set the brake. He stepped out first, boots crunching softly, and moved around to the wheelchair. Briggs was already there, tail low, body angled to shield as Eleanor was guided down the ramp. The front door opened before they reached the steps. Frank Wren stood framed in the doorway. He was taller than Wyatt had expected, despite the way age had bent him forward. Broad shoulders filled the old wool coat he wore, its elbows patched, its collar frayed. His hair was gray and cropped short, his beard neatly trimmed, more silver than dark. Deep lines cut his face lines earned, not neglected. He leaned on a cane, knuckles white around the handle. "Ellie," he said, relief and reprimand braided together, "you scared the hell out of me." "I told you I'd be late," Eleanor replied gently. "The storm decided otherwise." Frank's gaze flicked to Wyatt, then to Briggs. It lingered on the dog for half a second longer than politeness required. "Thank you," Frank said at last. The words were plain, but the look behind them wasn't. "For bringing her home." Wyatt nodded. "Of course." Inside, warmth pressed close, not the clean heat of new systems, but the lived-in kind radiators clicking, a space heater humming near the couch. The air smelled faintly of tea and old wood. A crocheted blanket lay folded over the back of a chair, stitches tight and careful. Wyatt maneuvered the wheelchair just inside the door. Briggs shook snow from his coat, then moved to Eleanor's side, settling close enough to touch without crowding. Frank closed the door, locking it out of habit. "I told you not to go out," he said, softer now. "Weather like this." Eleanor smiled. "And I told you the fridge was empty." Frank sighed. "You always win that one." He looked back at Wyatt. "Come in. Don't stand freezing on our threshold." Wyatt stepped inside. He didn't remove his jacket right away. He rarely did in unfamiliar places. They moved into the living room. Furniture sat where it had likely sat for years, arranged for function rather than display. A small table by the couch held a framed photograph. A young man in uniform, smiling awkwardly, eyes bright, with a certainty that hadn't yet been tested. Daniel. Wyatt felt the recognition settle quietly. Frank followed his gaze. "That's our boy?" He didn't elaborate. Eleanor reached for a kettle on the stove, hands practiced. "Tea?" "Yes," Wyatt said. Frank lowered himself into a chair with effort, the cane propped within reach. He watched Wyatt with a measuring, calm curiosity, tempered by a soldier's instinct not to ask until it mattered. "You served," Frank said finally. Not a question. Wyatt nodded. "Yes." "Navy," Frank said. Again, not a question. "Yes." Frank's jaw worked once, then stilled. So did I. Different wars, same ocean. He rubbed his knee absently. "Left me with this. Comes calling when the cold sets in." Wyatt glanced at the cane. "It usually does." Eleanor returned with mugs, placing them carefully. She noticed the direction of the conversation and smiled faintly. "I told you he'd understand." Frank grunted. "Understanding doesn't make it hurt less." "No," Wyatt agreed, "but it makes it easier to sit with." Silence followed. Comfortable. Earned. Briggs rose and began a slow circuit of the room. He sniffed the baseboards, the corners, the back hallway. Not anxious. Thorough. When he reached the rear door, he paused, head lifting slightly. Wyatt noticed. Briggs moved on, returning to lie near the couch, eyes open. "You've got a good dog," Frank said. "He's kept me alive," Wyatt replied. Frank studied Briggs, then nodded once. "That's the highest praise there is." Eleanor settled back, tea cradled in her hands. "Daniel loved dogs," she said. "Said they understood things people talked themselves out of." Briggs' ears flicked at the sound of the name. Eleanor noticed and smiled. "See? He hears him too." Frank didn't smile. His gaze had drifted back to the window, to the darkness beyond it. "We've had trouble," he said quietly. Wyatt waited. "Kids," Frank continued, "not kids really. Young men who haven't learned where the edge is yet." His fingers tightened on the cane. "They come through sometimes. Rude. Reckless. I don't worry about myself. I worry about her." Eleanor reached for his hand. "We've managed." Frank shook his head. "Managing isn't the same as being safe." Wyatt leaned forward slightly. "Have they come onto the property?" "Not yet," Frank said. "But they watch." Wyatt felt the words settle. Watching was never nothing. Briggs stood again and moved to the back window. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stared into the dark, body angled, weight balanced. Wyatt rose quietly and joined him. The yard stretched out behind the house, bordered by a thin line of cedars. Snow lay unbroken mostly. Near the tree line, something darker marked the white. A scuffed patch, indistinct. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He turned back to Frank. "Do you mind if I take a quick look around?" Frank hesitated, pride warring with relief. "I won't stop you." Wyatt pulled his jacket tighter and stepped out through the back door. Briggs followed immediately. The cold bit harder here, away from the house's small circle of warmth. Wyatt moved slowly, scanning, letting his eyes adjust. The scuffed snow resolved into footprints. Fresh, hurried, more than one set. Briggs lowered his head, sniffed once, then looked up at Wyatt. Not animals. Wyatt backed away carefully, returning to the house without comment. Inside, Eleanor watched his face. "What is it?" "Nothing you need to worry about tonight," Wyatt said. He meant it, for now. Frank read between the words. His shoulders squared, old instincts waking. "They've been here." "Yes." Frank exhaled slowly. "I thought so." They didn't discuss it further, not then. Some truths needed time to settle. Wyatt moved toward the door, preparing to leave. Eleanor looked startled. "You're going?" "For a bit," Wyatt said. "I'll come back later." Briggs paused at the threshold. He turned his head, looking past the house toward the cedars. He didn't move. Briggs pulled. Not hard, not frantic, just enough to stop Wyatt mid-step. The leash went taut. Briggs stood facing the darkness, body aligned, ears forward, every line of him pointing away from the road and back toward the trees. Wyatt felt a chill that had nothing to do with weather. Briggs didn't bark. He didn't whine. He waited. Wyatt followed his gaze and understood the message without words. Whatever was out there hadn't finished deciding. Wyatt released a slow breath and unclipped the leash. "All right," he murmured. "We'll stay close." Briggs relaxed a fraction. Decision acknowledged. Wyatt turned back to Eleanor and Frank. "I'm not far," he said. "If you need anything, anything you call." Frank nodded once. I will. Wyatt stepped off the porch, Briggs at his side. He walked to the edge of the yard and stopped, looking back once. The house glowed softly behind him, fragile, stubborn. Time had not been kind to it, but it hadn't erased it either. Wyatt turned toward the road, boots crunching softly, Briggs matching his pace. Behind them, the cedars stood silent, waiting. Morning arrived without ceremony. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and aching with cold. Snow lay thick across the ground, untouched except for the narrow track Wyatt's boots had carved when he returned to his truck hours earlier. The sky was pale, stretched thin like frosted glass, and the air carried that brittle silence that followed heavy snowfall. Wyatt hadn't gone far. He'd parked his truck just beyond the bend in the road, where the cedars thinned and the house disappeared from view. From there, he could see the faint glow of the porch light through the trees if he angled his head just right. Close enough to respond. Far enough not to intrude. Briggs had slept lightly in the passenger seat, head resting on his paws, rising at the slightest sound. He was nearly 7 now, his muzzle touched with gray, his movements no longer wasteful. Experience had shaped him the same way it shaped men. Fewer motions, clearer intent. When the first hint of dawn crept over the tree line, Briggs lifted his head and exhaled softly. Wyatt opened the door, boots crunching as he stepped out. Cold bit through his gloves instantly. He welcomed it. Cold kept him present. They walked the perimeter again. Fresh snow had hidden most of the night's signs, but not all. Near the cedars, one shallow depression remained, a place where someone had stood long enough for weight to matter. Wyatt crouched, fingers brushing the surface. Ice had formed along the edges. Recent. Briggs sniffed, then looked up, ears rotating. Wyatt straightened. Not now, he murmured. The house behind them stirred. A door opened. Light spilled onto the porch, followed by the sound of a cane tapping wood. Frank stepped out slowly, coat pulled tight around his broad frame. He looked smaller in the morning light, age more apparent without shadows to hide in. You didn't go far? Frank said. No, Wyatt replied. I said I wouldn't. Frank nodded, eyes moving over the yard, the trees. Ellie's still asleep. That's good. They stood side by side for a moment. 2 men, shaped by the same ocean, listening to the same quiet. You saw something, Frank said. Wyatt didn't deny it. Someone was back here last night. Frank's jaw tightened. I knew it. They didn't come close to the house, Wyatt added. Not yet. Frank's grip tightened on the cane. They're testing. Yes. Frank let out a breath that fogged the air. I hate being a problem. Wyatt turned to him. You're not. Frank snorted softly. Feels like it. Wyatt didn't argue. He understood the weight of that thought too well. Inside, Eleanor woke to the sound of the voices and joined them a short while later, bundled in her faded sea blue coat, hair neatly pinned despite the early hour. Her face tightened when she saw the 2 men standing at the edge of the yard. What's wrong? She asked. Nothing, Frank said too quickly. Wyatt met her gaze. There were people near the trees last night. They didn't come up to the house. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was fear there, but also resolve. They came before, she said quietly, after Daniel died. Teenagers mostly, angry, Bored, they'd shout things from the road, sometimes throw bottles. Frank looked away. They stopped, Eleanor continued. For a while. Wyatt nodded. They're back. Eleanor's hand found Frank's arm. We've lived through worse. Frank covered her hand with his own. We shouldn't have to. Wyatt cleared his throat. I'll be around today. I need to get supplies anyway. Eleanor searched his face. You don't owe us? Yeah, Wyatt said gently. I do. He left shortly after, promising to return before dusk. The town looked different in daylight. Snow softened its edges, made even the worn storefronts appear gentler than they were. Wyatt parked near the cafe and stepped inside, Briggs at his side. Sarah looked up from behind the counter, her auburn hair tucked into a knit cap, cheeks flushed from the cold. Back again, she said. Storm treat you kindly? Wyatt nodded. Quiet night. Sarah studied his face longer than usual. Quiet isn't always good. No, Wyatt agreed. She poured him coffee without asking. I heard shouting last night, she said, down near the old Wren place. Wyatt's eyes lifted. You hear a lot around here. Sarah shrugged. People talk when they think no one's listening. Who? Wyatt asked. Sarah hesitated. Boys from up north. Cole Riker and his friends. Rich families, no consequences. They get bored. Wyatt filed the name away. They were the ones at the grocery store, Sarah added. The ones bothering Eleanor. Wyatt's expression didn't change. But something inside him shifted quietly, decisively. Sarah lowered her voice. You should be careful. Wyatt met her gaze. So should they. Sarah swallowed. You sound like someone who's been here before. Wyatt took a sip of coffee. Too many times. He spent the afternoon gathering supplies, groceries, extra propane, medication Frank mentioned needing but hadn't wanted to ask for. At the hardware store, he noticed the stairs. Curious. Measuring. Briggs stayed close, calm but alert. By mid-afternoon, clouds rolled back in, heavy and low. Snow threatened again. Wyatt returned to the house just before dusk. Eleanor was awake, seated near the window, knitting slowly. Frank sat across from her, radio low, pretending not to watch the road. You're back, Eleanor said, relief threading her voice. Wyatt set the supplies down. I told you I would be. They shared a simple meal. Conversation stayed light weather, small-town news, the way snow changed sound. But beneath it all ran a current of tension that never fully eased. As darkness fell, Briggs grew restless. Not pacing, watching. He moved from window to window, stopping each time just long enough to confirm something only he could sense. His ears flicked toward the road more than once. Wyatt noticed. He always did. He stood and stretched, adjusting his jacket. I'll take a walk. Frank started to protest, then stopped himself. I'll stay by the phone. Wyatt nodded. Outside, the world had shrunk again. Snow began to fall. Slow, deliberate flakes that caught the porch light and vanished. Wyatt and Briggs moved toward the tree line. Halfway there, Briggs froze. Not stiff, focused. Wyatt followed his gaze. Headlights. 2 sets. They cut through the falling snow at the edge of the road, slowing as they passed the house. One car rolled past. The other slowed further, then stopped. Wyatt didn't move. The car idled for a moment longer, then coincidence allowed. Then it pulled away, tires spinning slightly before catching. Briggs growled low in his throat. Wyatt placed a hand on his shoulder. Easy, They returned to the house without incident. Inside, Eleanor watched their faces. They came back? Yes, sir, Wyatt said. Frank's voice was steady. What do we do? Wyatt didn't answer right away. He looked at the house, the thin walls, the old locks, the stubborn warmth held together by habit and care. We don't escalate, Wyatt said finally. Not yet. Frank nodded slowly. And if they do? Wyatt met his eyes. Then we hold the line. Briggs settled at Wyatt's feet, head up, eyes open. The night deepened. Snow fell heavier. Somewhere beyond the cedars, engines echoed faintly, then faded. But the quiet that followed was different now, not empty, expectant. Night came down hard. The snow returned after dusk. Not gentle this time, but heavy and insistent, falling in thick sheets that swallowed sound and distance. The world beyond the windows dissolved into white and shadow. The cedars reduced to dark silhouettes that swayed like witnesses who refused to speak. Inside the house, the lights stayed low. Frank sat in his chair near the radio, volume barely above a whisper. His cane rested across his knees, hands folded over it, knuckles swollen and stiff. He hadn't said much since sunset. Men like him learned early that talking didn't always help when instinct had already decided something was wrong. Eleanor remained by the window, her knitting untouched in her lap. The sea blue coat she'd worn earlier hung over the back of her chair, still damp at the hem. Her eyes moved off into the glass, searching the snow for shapes that didn't belong. Wyatt stood near the door, jacket on, boots laced. He hadn't sat down. Briggs lay at his feet, body relaxed but alert, head resting on his paws, eyes open. The gray along his muzzle caught the lamplight. At nearly 7, he no longer wasted energy on false alarms. When he moved now, it meant something. The house creaked as the wind pressed against it. Frank cleared his throat. They'll try something tonight. It wasn't fear in his voice. It was certainty. Wyatt nodded. Yes. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. I won't hide, she said quietly. No one's asking you to, Wyatt replied. Silence returned, thick and waiting. Then Briggs lifted his head, not suddenly, deliberately. His ears angled toward the road, his tail stilled. Wyatt felt it before he heard it, the low vibration through the floorboards, the subtle change in pressure that came with approaching engines. Headlights flared through the falling snow. One car, then another. They slowed near the house. Briggs rose to his feet, muscles coiling, not barking, not growling, watching. Frank pushed himself up with effort, cane scraping the floor. I knew it. Wyatt raised a hand. Stay here. I won't, Frank said, jaw set. This is my house. Wyatt met his eyes. Then stand behind me. Eleanor's voice was steady. Be careful. Wyatt nodded once. He reached down, resting his hand briefly on Briggs' neck. With me. The door opened, letting cold and snow spill inside. Outside, the night was alive now. 2 vehicles idled near the edge of the yard, headlights washing the snow in harsh white. Shadows moved within them. Doors opened. 4 young men stepped out. They were bundled in expensive winter jackets, boots too clean for the work they pretended to know. Their faces were flushed from drink and bravado, eyes bright with the reckless confidence of people who'd never been stopped before. Cole Riker stepped forward first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, hair styled carefully even in the storm. His jaw was sharp, his expression amused rather than angry. The kind of man who smiled when he hurt people, because he believed the world would let him. "Well," Cole called out, voice carrying easily. "Look at this place. Thought we'd come to say hello." Wyatt stepped off the porch, positioning himself between the house and the group. Briggs moved with him, stopping just at Wyatt's left side, body angled, eyes locked forward. "Leave," Wyatt said. Cole laughed. "You don't give orders here." One of the others snorted. "That the guy from the store?" "The hero," another said. "Thought you could embarrass us and walk away." Wyatt didn't respond. He watched their hands, their spacing, the way they spread just enough to feel threatening, but not enough to commit. Cole took another step forward. "You owe us," he said. "Damages, emotional distress, whatever word you want to use." "You spilled your own drink," Wyatt replied. Cole shrugged. "Old woman caused it." Behind Wyatt, Eleanor's breath caught. Frank tightened his grip on the cane. Briggs shifted his weight. Wyatt's voice stayed even. "This is your last warning." Cole's smile faded. "Just a little." "Or what?" One of the men reached into his jacket and pulled out a metal baton, letting it tap lightly against his palm. Another held a length of wood, fingers white around it. The snow thickened, falling faster now, blurring the edges of the world. Briggs growled, low, controlled, a sound that came from somewhere deep and ancient. Cole glanced at the dog, then back at Wyatt. "You think that mutt scares us?" Briggs took one step forward. Wyatt didn't stop him. That was the moment. The baton swung. Wyatt moved, years of training compressed into instinct distance, angle, timing. He stepped inside the arc of the swing, catching the attacker's wrist and redirecting the momentum. The baton flew free, disappearing into the snow. Briggs lunged, not to bite, but to intercept. He slammed his body into the second man's legs, knocking him off balance, forcing him down into the snow with a bark that split the night. Chaos erupted. Shouts, slipping boots. Snow kicked up in frantic bursts. Frank shouted from the porch. Eleanor screamed his name. Cole backed away, surprise flashing across his face. "Get him!" Another attacker rushed Wyatt. Wyatt pivoted, deflecting the blow, driving the man backward. He didn't strike to punish, only to stop. Briggs stood over the man he'd knocked down, teeth bared, eyes blazing, body rigid with restraint. He didn't bite. He waited. Sirens cut through the storm. Red and blue lights exploded across the yard, painting the snow in violent color. The sound froze everything. Cole swore. "Cops!" The baton clattered as another man dropped it. One tried to run, slipping hard and falling face first into the snow. Police vehicles skidded to a stop near the road. Doors flew open. Voices shouted commands, sharp, practiced. "Hands where we can see them! Now!" The boys froze, bravado collapsing into panic. Cole hesitated, eyes flicking to Wyatt, then to Briggs. For a brief second, something like fear broke through. He raised his hands. Officers moved in quickly, cuffing, separating, reading rights that vanished into the wind. Wyatt stepped back slowly, heart pounding, breath steady. Briggs returned to his side, posture easing only when Wyatt rested a hand on his neck. Frank let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Eleanor sank onto the porch step, trembling. An officer approached Wyatt. He was middle-aged, face tired but alert. "You the one who called this in?" "No," Wyatt said, "but I'm glad someone did." The officer nodded, eyes moving over the scene, the old house, the snow, the dog standing like a sentinel. "Looks like things got out of hand." They came here looking for it, Wyatt replied. The officer didn't argue. As the boys were loaded into cruisers, another vehicle arrived, unmarked. A woman stepped out. She was in her 40s, hair cut short and iron gray, posture straight and efficient. Her coat bore no local insignia. Her eyes missed nothing. She approached Wyatt, then glanced at Briggs. "Agent Miller," she said. "Federal." Wyatt's brow furrowed slightly. "We've had reports about these boys," she continued. "Harassment, vandalism, intimidation. Tonight gave us what we needed." Wyatt nodded once. Agent Miller looked toward the house, where Eleanor and Frank stood together, holding on to each other. "They'll be safe tonight." Wyatt followed her gaze. "And after?" Agent Miller met his eyes. "After, people will have to decide who they want to be." The officers finished their work. Engines started. Sirens faded into the snow. Silence returned. But it wasn't empty anymore. Wyatt walked back to the porch. Eleanor reached out, gripping his sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to." "Yes," Wyatt said softly. "I did." Frank's voice broke slightly. "My son, he would have stood where you did." Wyatt held his gaze. "He did," he said, "through you." Briggs sat at Wyatt's feet, snow clinging to his fur, chest rising slow and steady. The house still stood. The line had been crossed, and it had held. Morning came slowly, as if the town itself were unsure whether it deserved the light. The snowstorm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed pale and thin. Sunlight crept over rooftops and fences, catching on frozen branches and turning them briefly to glass. The yard behind the Wren house was marked with tracks, now boots, tires, the shallow impressions left by hurried movement the night before. Proof that the quiet had been broken. Inside, the house felt different. Not safer exactly, but steadier. Eleanor sat at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't finished. She'd slept little. Neither had Frank. But the tension that had pressed against their ribs for days had eased, replaced by something heavier and unfamiliar. Aftermath. Frank stood near the window, cane planted firmly, staring out at the yard. His posture was straighter than usual, shoulders squared despite the ache in his leg. Pain had always been easier to carry than fear. Wyatt remained by the door, jacket still on, boots unlaced but not removed. Old habits didn't loosen overnight. Briggs lay at his feet, stretched out now, finally allowing himself real rest. His chest rose and fell in a deep, even rhythm. "You should go," Eleanor said quietly, not looking at Wyatt. "You've done more than enough." Wyatt shook his head. "Not yet." Frank turned. "They won't be back today." "No," Wyatt agreed, "but today matters." Eleanor looked up then, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. "Matters how?" Wyatt met her gaze. "In towns like this, people decide who they believe after the noise stops." As if summoned by the words, a car slowed outside, then another. Frank frowned. "That's unusual." Wyatt moved to the window. A familiar sedan pulled to the curb. The cafe logo faded on the door. Sarah stepped out, bundled in a long coat, auburn hair tucked under a knit cap. She carried 2 paper bags, one under each arm. Behind her, a pickup truck idled. An older man climbed out slowly, leaning on a cane thin, stooped, his gray hair combed carefully back. He held a box of groceries against his chest. More cars followed. Wyatt exhaled softly, That? The knock on the door was hesitant, respectful. Frank opened it. Sarah stood there, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes uncertain but determined. "Morning," she said. "We heard about last night." Behind her, the older man shifted his weight. "Thought you might need some help." Eleanor rose slowly. For a moment, she didn't speak. She simply looked at the bags, at the people gathering on the road, at the way neighbors stood awkwardly, unsure how close was too close. Then she smiled. "Please," she said, "come in." The house filled gradually, not all at once. No crowding, just one or two at a time. A woman from 2 streets over who brought soup and apologized for not speaking up sooner. A young couple with a toddler bundled between them, offering to shovel the drive. The retired school teacher who'd taught Daniel years ago, eyes wet as she set down a stack of old notebooks she'd kept all this time. Wyatt stayed back, observing. He recognized the pattern, guilt finding its voice now that fear had loosened its grip. Briggs woke and lifted his head as people entered, tail thumping once against the floor. He allowed hands to touch his fur, patient, watchful. Children gravitated toward him instinctively. Animals often made it easier for people to cross emotional ground they couldn't name. Sarah moved easily through the room, organizing cups, setting out food, as if this had always been her place. Up close, her tiredness showed more clearly faint shadows beneath her eyes, skin worn by long shifts and quiet listening. But there was resolve there too. She'd decided something last night. She approached Wyatt when she had a moment. "The boys were arrested," she said quietly. "Federal charges, from what I hear. Turns out a lot of people had stories they never told." Wyatt nodded. "They usually do." Sarah hesitated. "I'm sorry," she said, "for not stepping in sooner. At the store, before." Wyatt considered her words, then shook his head. "You showed up today." Sarah swallowed. "That has to count for something." "It does," Wyatt said. Near the window, Frank sat with the older man who'd arrived earlier. They spoke softly, 2 veterans recognizing the familiar weight in each other's posture. Frank's voice was low, but steady as he spoke about his service, about the leg that never healed right, about the son who'd carried the same uniform farther than he ever could. Wyatt watched as Eleanor listened from across the room, hands folded, shoulders easing with each shared memory. For the first time since he'd met her, she wasn't alone with her grief. Halfway through the morning, a pair of official vehicles pulled up. No sirens. No urgency. Agent Miller stepped out, coat buttoned, hair neat despite the cold. She carried a folder under one arm. With her was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, wearing a dark overcoat, someone whose authority didn't need to announce itself. The room stilled as they entered. Agent Miller scanned the space quickly, cataloging faces, emotions. Then she nodded once, satisfied. "Mrs. Wren," she said, approaching Eleanor. "Mr. Wren." Eleanor straightened. Frank reached for her hand. "We wanted to update you," Agent Miller continued. "The individuals involved last night are in custody. Charges are moving forward." Frank's jaw tightened. "And after?" Agent Miller met his eyes. "After, there will be consequences. Real ones." Eleanor exhaled slowly. The man beside Agent Miller stepped forward. "I'm Deputy U.S. Attorney Hayes," he said. He was tall, broad through the chest, hair dark with gray at the temples. His voice carried calm authority. "We're also reviewing prior reports. Ones that were ignored. That's changing." A murmur moved through the room. Agent Miller's gaze shifted to Wyatt. You stayed. Yes, Wyatt replied. You didn't have to, Hayes said. Wyatt met his eyes evenly. Someone did. Hayes studied him for a long moment, then nodded. We won't forget that. Briggs rose and moved to sit beside Wyatt, leaning lightly against his leg. As the conversation continued, Briggs's ears flicked. He turned his head not toward the door, but toward the framed photograph on the wall. Daniel. Briggs stood and walked to it slowly, stopping just beneath the frame. He sat, looking up, tail still, posture attentive, almost reverent. The room fell quiet. Eleanor noticed first. Her breath caught. He does that sometimes, she whispered, with Daniel's picture. Wyatt felt something shift in his chest. Briggs didn't move. For a brief moment, it felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, past and present brushing close enough to recognize each other. Then Briggs turned, satisfied, and returned to Wyatt's side. The spell broke. But something had been set. By afternoon, the crowd thinned. People left behind promises, rides to appointments, repairs to be made, meals to deliver. Quiet commitments, spoken without ceremony. The house felt warmer when they were gone. Wyatt stood by the door again, jacket back on. I'll be heading out, he said. Eleanor's eyes widened. So soon? I don't belong here, Wyatt replied gently. Not the way you do. Frank stepped forward, offering his hand. You stood when it mattered. Wyatt took it. So did you. Eleanor approached last. She placed her hand briefly over Wyatt's heart. My son would have liked you, she said. Not because you fought, because you stayed. Wyatt swallowed. He already did. Outside, the sun dipped lower, light turning gold against the snow. Wyatt walked to his truck, Briggs close at his side. Behind them, the house stood quieter now, but not forgotten. The town had remembered, and remembering, Wyatt knew, was sometimes the hardest part. Wyatt left before the sun had fully committed to the day. Morning hovered in that uncertain space between night and light. The sky, a pale gray, stretched thin over snowbound roofs. The town slept again, not in fear this time, but in something closer to recovery. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. A plow groaned somewhere in the distance, metal scraping ice, doing the slow work that followed storms. Wyatt moved quietly, boots crunching soft against packed snow. Briggs walked beside him, leash loose, breath steady. The dog's gait had changed over the years, less spring, more purpose, but his presence remained constant, anchoring. At the edge of the Wren driveway, Wyatt stopped. The house stood still, its porch light off now, windows dark. It looked smaller in daylight, stripped of last night's drama. Just a place where people lived, where memory pressed into the walls and refused to leave. Wyatt took a breath, then turned away. They drove out of town as the light strengthened, passing familiar landmarks made gentler by distance. The cafe, the grocery store, the bend in the road where cedars crowded close and the world narrowed. He didn't go far. A mile beyond town, Wyatt pulled off onto a narrow overlook that faced a shallow valley. Snow blanketed the land in uninterrupted white, broken only by dark tree lines and a frozen creek that cut a thin, crooked path through it. Wyatt shut off the engine. Briggs jumped down first, sniffed the air, then sat, watching the horizon. Wyatt leaned against the truck, arms folded, breath fogging. This was usually the point when he left places behind, when he let the road stretch and erase. But today, his feet stayed planted. He thought of Eleanor, standing straighter than she had days ago. Of Frank, pain still there but no longer alone with it. Of the town, awkward and sincere, trying to remember how to do the right thing after too much time practicing silence. He thought of Daniel. Wyatt reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn photograph. The edges were soft, corners bent. He hadn't meant to take it. Eleanor had pressed it into his hand before he left, eyes firm. "For the road," she'd said. The image showed Daniel younger than Wyatt remembered, barely more than a boy. He stood beside a river, uniform crisp, smile unsure. The world hadn't yet asked everything of him. Briggs stood and stepped closer, nose brushing Wyatt's hand. "He was good," Wyatt said quietly. "You'd have liked him." Briggs' tail thumped once. Wyatt crouched, resting his forearms on his knees. "He held the line," he continued, "long enough." The words tasted familiar. He remembered another night, years ago, in a place where snow never fell. A different silence, a different house that didn't make it through the dark. He'd carried that with him ever since. A weight he'd learned to walk with but never set down. Until now, a sound broke the stillness, a vehicle approaching on the road behind them. Wyatt turned. A sedan pulled in slowly and stopped a respectful distance away. The door opened and Sarah stepped out, bundled against the cold. Her auburn hair was loose today, wind-tossed, cheeks red. She looked smaller outside the cafe, less certain but no less determined. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, hands tucked into her coat pockets. Wyatt straightened. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Sarah smiled faintly. "Seems like that rule applies to everyone." She walked closer, gaze moving across the valley. "Town's buzzing," she said. "People talking, remembering things they wish they hadn't forgotten." "That's normal," Wyatt replied. "It fades." "Sometimes," Sarah said. "Sometimes it sticks." She hesitated, then added, "They're putting up a plaque." Wyatt frowned slightly. "For what?" "For Daniel," Sarah said. "And for others like him, veterans, people who left and didn't come back." Wyatt looked down at the photo still in his hand. Sarah followed his gaze. "Eleanor asked me to tell you. She said it felt wrong not to." Wyatt nodded once. "Thank you." Sarah shifted her weight, then spoke again. "What about you?" Wyatt met her eyes. "What about me?" "Are you leaving?" she asked, not accusing, curious. Wyatt considered the road stretching away behind them, the ease of movement, the safety of distance. "I don't know," he said honestly. Sarah smiled, not brightly, but with understanding. "That's okay." She looked at Briggs, who watched her calmly, eyes clear. "He's changed," she said. Wyatt glanced down. "So have I." Sarah took a step back. "If you stay, the cafe could use help, not with serving, just being around." Wyatt almost laughed. "Almost." "I'll think about it," he said. Sarah nodded. "That's all anyone can ask." She left without lingering, car disappearing down the road, sound fading quickly. Wyatt remained. The wind shifted, clouds moved. Light changed its angle, revealing faint tracks in the snow evidence of what had been. Already softening. Briggs moved again, circling Wyatt once before stopping directly in front of him. He sat, and then, unexpectedly, he leaned forward, resting his head against Wyatt's chest. Wyatt froze. Briggs had always stayed close, always watched. But this was different. This was wait, trust. Wyatt's breath caught. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to that contact, the steady heat of the dog, the slow rhythm of shared breath. Wyatt felt something loosen, something he hadn't realized he was still holding together. He rested his hand on Briggs' head, fingers pressing into familiar fur. "All right," he murmured. "I hear you." Briggs didn't move. When he finally did, it was only to sit back. Decision made. Wyatt stood and tucked the photograph carefully into his jacket. They returned to town by late morning. People noticed them now, not with curiosity, but recognition. A nod here, a wave there. No heroics, just acknowledgement. At the Wren house, a small gathering had formed. Not formal, not loud. A simple moment. Eleanor stood near the porch, wrapped in her sea blue coat, Frank beside her. A wooden post had been placed near the walkway. A plaque rested against it, not yet mounted. Eleanor saw Wyatt and smiled. "You came back." "Yes," Wyatt said. Frank extended his hand. Wyatt shook it firmly. "We wanted you here," Frank said, "for this." They didn't make speeches, no microphones, no flags, just Eleanor reading a few lines she'd written herself about service, about silence, about remembering before it was too late. When she finished, she turned to Wyatt. "I used to think my son died alone," she said. "Now I know he didn't." Wyatt swallowed. "He wasn't." They mounted the plaque together, names etched cleanly. Not many, enough. Briggs sat at Wyatt's side throughout, steady, present. As the gathering dispersed, Frank lingered. "You know," he said, voice low, "I spent my life thinking I'd done my part. Turns out, part of it was waiting long enough to say thank you." Wyatt nodded. "We all wait for something." Frank smiled faintly. "Guess we did." That evening, Wyatt returned to the cafe, not as a customer. He took a seat by the window, coffee untouched, watching the town settle into itself. Briggs lay beneath the table, eyes half closed, content. Sarah caught his eye from behind the counter. She raised an eyebrow. Wyatt smiled, just a little. Outside, snow began to fall again light this time, almost playful. The town didn't retreat. Lights stayed on, doors opened, voices carried. Wyatt leaned back, listening. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like something to endure. It felt like something earned. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the heavens. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, through a stranger who refuses to look away, through a loyal dog who senses danger before words are spoken, through a tired town that finally remembers how to stand for what is right. God does not always remove pain from our lives, but He places light inside it. He sends people into our path at the exact moment when silence would have destroyed us. He reminds us that courage does not have to be loud, and that goodness, even when delayed, is never wasted. In our daily lives, we may feel small, unseen, or powerless. But every time we choose to protect the vulnerable, every time we stand between cruelty and compassion, we become part of something greater than ourselves. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about a moment when faith, kindness, or courage changed your life. Subscribe to this channel so more stories of light can reach those still walking through the dark. May God bless you, keep you safe, and remind you that even the smallest act of goodness can become a miracle in someone else's life.